皆さん、こんばんは、キャブシンです。2月1日ですね、水曜日、米国株見ながら FF11 やっていきたいと思います。今日はね、もう4時からあと10分ですけどね、パウエルさんが FOMC の、FOMC 後のね、会見のインタビューがあるんですけど、まあ、そうですね、まあ、インタビュー中はね、上下動ね、激しいと思うんですけどね。まあ、普通入らない方がいいんですけどね。うん。で、終わった後もね、一日ちょっと置いてみないとね、騙しとかがあるんでね。まあね、だいぶね。まあちょっとね、注意していかないといけないんですけど。で、金曜雇用統計ですよね。雇用統計見てからじゃないとね、やっぱ動けないですよね。金曜の、まあ、ISM、非製造業指数見てから動いたら、でも雇用統計出た時点でね、動きわかるからね。でも ADP 雇用統計良かったんでしょう。ちょっと待って。いやーねあれ、雇用統計少なくなってんな。雇用が悪化している。雇用コストは下がっている。雇用が悪化している。とか、雇用統計も悪そうな感じだね。これはね、雇用統計悪いのかな。だって上がっていくよね。早く利下げしようっていう市場からの圧力来るんじゃねえかな。雇用統計悪かったらね。雇用統計悪かったら下がるっていうケースになるからね。あ、くのみさんこんばんはです。4時からもそうそう会見ありますけど。まあ、どっちに動くかっすよね。まあ、自分はノーポジなんですけどね。ちょっと、まあ、まあ、ちょっと入るべきところじゃないんですよね。まあ、上がりは、まあ、ちょっと期待できるけどね。上がりはちょっと期待できるところですね。ロックルが結構上がってるの今日。半導体株が上がってるのか。ちょっと、テスラですか。テスラでも今日上がってきてますよね。 今日は、まあ、全体的に指数が悪くて、半導体株が強いのかな。これちょっと半導体株、なんか全体的に悪かったら下げられる。全体的に悪いけど、わかんないです。でも雇用統計までだね。ちょっと、金曜までわかんないですね。今日下がっても明日上がる可能性もあるし、わかんないね。ガーファムの決算もあるでしょ。今日終わったら、ベタの決算あるでしょ。ベタの決算あって、で、木曜のアフターがガーファムの決算だから、やっぱ金曜までっすね。金曜で決まる感じですかね、動きが。でもメタの決算で大体わかるのかな。いやー、難しいね。ちょっとパウレさんの発言、超株が落とすタカ的な発言かどうかですよね。決算、各企業の決算良かったですからね。これはね。
Federal Reserve System works every day to support a growing and stable U.S. economy. Across the United States, the Federal Reserve, through its Federal Reserve Education Program, also helps people understand how the economy works, so consumers have the tools to make sound financial decisions.
始まった。
Through this education program, teachers have access to classroom-ready online
めっちゃ下がってんじゃん。
students from
おい
kindergarten to college, videos, classroom lessons, online education,
何もしてないで
publications,
下がってん
and
の。
more. These resources are all free for educators to use in
おい、
their
始
lesson
まった下がっ
plans
たぞ。
or as they see fit. Many of the Federal Reserve System's regional reserve banks, located in 12 districts across the nation,
なんで
also
下がっ
offer
てんの？何も
in-person
話してねえ
and
か。
online professional development that allows educators to deepen their knowledge and hone their craft
あ、
when it
プレ
comes
ス
to
リリースが。
economics, personal finance, and more. Students
プレ
too
ス
can
リリー
take
スが。
advantage of in-person opportunities by taking tours of exhibits in many of the 12 Federal Reserve banks around the country. Whether a
プレ
student
スリリー
visits
ス
with
が
their
どっかで出たけ
family
ど、ちょ
or
っ
a
と
school group, they
どこ
get an
だ？
in-depth look at how the Federal Reserve works to promote a healthy, sustainable U.S. economy. At the board and reserve banks, students also get hands-on opportunities like internships and participation on student boards, which introduce them to key economics concepts and potential careers in economics and finance. Consumers are empowered to make sound financial decisions through the availability of easy-to-understand resources that explain personal finance concepts, the broader economy, and the Federal Reserve's role in it. Federal Reserve Education is committed to equipping
最近の試合
educators
質と生産緩やかな
students
成長
and
を示し
empowering
ている。
consumers
ここ
when
数
it
学
comes to
雇用の増が
understanding
堅
and
調で失業率が
participating
低い
in
ま
our
まです。
evolving economy. For more information, visit federalreserveeducation.org to find links to resources and reserve bank programs offered near
4
you,
月
and follow Federal Reserve
に
Education on Twitter at @FedEconEd.
まあ 0.25% 引き上げるってことかな。
What is the Fed?
So what is the Fed?
What is the Fed?
What is the Fed?
The Federal Reserve, often referred to as the Fed, is the central bank of the United States.
Congress created the Fed in 1913.
メールか電話してください。気になる方は。
System for our nation. The Fed includes the Board of Governors in Washington, D.C., which has 7 members, including the chairman and vice chairman.
All of the members of the board are appointed by the President of the United States and confirmed by the United States Senate.
The Fed also includes 12 regional Federal Reserve banks located in cities throughout the country.
The reserve banks serve
引き
as
締め
central banks' operating arms and also gather economic information from all over the country.
To help the Fed both monitor the economy and
イン
get
フレ
the
率
broad
2% 目標を
necessary
強くコミットし
Develop
ます。
and implement effective
2% まで締め付けるよってことか。うん。なんで、利下げは全然、まあ、そんなこと考える余地もねえよってことで、株下がっていくのか。さあ、どうな
Board
る
of Governors from the Reserve Bank.
To assess the conditions and outlook for
初動は下げっぽいけど
In addition to conducting monetary policy, the Federal Reserve also helps to supervise and regulate the nation's banks and works to promote a stable financial system for consumers, communities, and businesses.
The Fed also works with communities, nonprofit organizations, and others across the nation to address housing problems, promote equal access to credit, and advance economic and community development.
The Fed also promotes stability in the financial system, because instability in the financial system can pose a severe threat to the broader economy and to communities across the nation.
The Fed also acts as a bank to other banks by clearing checks, making electronic payments, and providing the currency that Americans need and use every day.
Our nation's economy and financial system face constant challenges.
The Fed is working every day to address those challenges and is committed to helping foster good economic conditions and outcomes.
employment opportunities, stable prices, and financial stability that benefit all Americans.
And we are also the Fed.
To learn more about the Federal Reserve,
どっ
find
ちは
a
どう
wide
だ
range of
ちょっと待って
resources on the Board of Governors website at federalreserve.gov.
始まらんな。もう4時過ぎてるの。始まんねー。株上がってきたな。すごいね。
熊の実体験まで動きなさそうですね。
そうですね。ちょっと一旦、まだ上がってますけどね。一旦落ちてから。 仮に今日上がっても、今日の決算後のやつが影響なんかあるか。メタか。メタ悪かったら Google も悪いってことになって、まあでもスナップも悪かったから、メタも今日悪いよな。今日下がるなら、明日も下がりそうな気がするけど、まあでも高派ですから、高派だから、高派だからね。でもね、まあ、今、米国株よりね、回転寿司株だよな。今下がってるから。風評被害下がってるけど、絶対上がるだろ、あれ。回転寿司株。わかりやすいだろ、あれ、上がるの。あっちの方がわかりやすいだろ、動き。4時半に変わったのか、もしかして。あ、4時半なんだ。4時じゃなくて。4時に、まあ、プレスリリース出て、4時半から開演か。すいませんでした。ちょっと、11の方やります。11やります。4時半から会見なんで。 上がってきちゃってんね。えー、 絡まれてる？絡んでくるんかい。こっから落ちるのか。南、西、北。南、西、北。ここか。リフトねえじゃん。やべ、迷ってる。戻っちゃったよ。ああ、ちょっと来ちゃったね。上がってきた。上がってきた。誰もマスクしてないね。
Good afternoon and welcome. My colleagues and I understand the hardship that high inflation is causing, and we are strongly committed to
サウジコロナかかってたみたいな。
our 2% goal. Over the past year, we've taken forceful actions to tighten the stance of monetary policy. We've covered a lot of ground, and the full effects of our rapid tightening so far are yet to be felt. Even so, we have more work to do. Price stability is the responsibility of the Federal Reserve and serves as the bedrock of our economy. Without price stability, the economy does not work for anyone. In particular, without price stability, we will not achieve a sustained period of labor market conditions that benefit all. Today, the FOMC raised our policy interest rate by 25 basis points. We continue to anticipate that ongoing increases will be appropriate in order to attain a stance of monetary policy that is sufficiently restrictive to return inflation to 2% over time. In addition, we are continuing the process of significantly reducing the size of our balance sheet. Restoring price stability will likely require maintaining a restrictive stance for some time. I will have more to say about today's monetary policy actions after briefly reviewing economic developments. The U.S. economy slowed significantly last year, with real GDP rising at a below-trend pace of 1%. Recent indicators point to modest growth in spending and production this quarter. Consumer spending appears to be expanding at a subdued pace, in part reflecting tighter financial conditions over the past year. Activity in the housing sector continues to weaken, largely reflecting higher mortgage rates. Higher interest rates and slower output growth also appear to be weighing on business fixed investment.
住宅市場は弱くなる。
Despite the slowdown in growth, the labor market remains extremely tight, with the
ローン
unemployment
金利
rate
が
at
高いんで。
50-year low, job vacancies still very high, and wage growth elevated. Job gains have been robust, with employment rising by an average of
住宅市場は大きくな弱くなるけど、労働市場はあんま弱くはなってない。賃金も伸びてるし、雇用も増加なんで、全然まだ雇用が強い、労働市場が強いんで、まだ引き締めるよって。
Over the 12 months ending in December, total PCE prices rose 5.0%. Excluding the volatile food and energy categories, core PCE prices rose 4.4%. The inflation data received over the past 3 months show a welcome reduction in the monthly pace of increases. And while recent developments are encouraging, we will need substantially more evidence to be confident that inflation is on a sustained downward
過
path.
去3ヶ月小の削減を歓迎しています。毎月のペースで増加しています。
Expectations appear to remain well anchored, as reflected in a broad range of surveys of households, businesses, and forecasters, as well as measures from financial markets. But that's not grounds for complacency. Although inflation has moderated recently, it remains too high. The longer the current bout of high inflation continues, the greater the chance that expectations of higher inflation will become entrenched. The Fed's monetary policy actions are guided by our mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. My colleagues and I are acutely aware that high inflation imposes significant hardship as it erodes purchasing power, especially for those least able to meet the higher costs of essentials like food, housing, and transportation. We are highly attentive to the risks that inflation poses to both sides of our mandate, and we are strongly committed to returning inflation to our 2% objective. At today's meeting, the committee raised the target range for the federal funds rate by 25 basis points, bringing the target range to 4.5% to 4.75%. And we are continuing the process of significantly reducing the size of our balance sheet. With today's action, we have raised interest rates by 4.5 percentage points over the past year. We continue to anticipate that ongoing increases in the target range for the federal funds rate will be
観点
appropriate
は
in order to
私た
attain
ち
a
は
stance of
座ってい
monetary
ます。
policy that is
4.5%
sufficiently
過去に
restrictive to return inflation to
増加
2%
の
over time.
4.75%
We are seeing the effects of our policy actions on demand in the most interest-sensitive sectors of the
でイン
economy.
フレ率 2% まで絶対戻しますと。
It will take time, however, for the full effects of monetary restraint to be realized, especially on inflation. In light of the cumulative tightening of monetary policy and the lags with
レイさんおはようございます。
affects economic activity and inflation, the committee decided to raise interest rates by 25 basis points today, continuing the step down from last year's rapid pace of increases. Shifting to a slower pace will better allow the committee to assess the economy's progress toward our goals, as we determine the extent of future increases that will be required to attain a sufficiently restrictive stance. We will continue to make our decisions meeting by meeting, taking into account the totality of incoming data and their implications for the outlook for economic activity and inflation. We have been taking forceful steps to moderate demand so that it comes into better alignment with supply. Our overarching focus is using our tools to bring inflation back down to our 2% goal and to keep longer-term inflation expectations well anchored. Reducing inflation is likely to require a period of below-trend growth and some softening of labor market conditions. Restoring price stability is essential to set the stage for achieving maximum employment and stable prices over the longer run. The historical record cautions strongly against prematurely loosening policy. We will stay the course until the job is done. To conclude, we understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. We at the Fed will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
質問タイムね。
Chris Rugaber, Associated Press. Thank you for doing this. As you know, financial conditions have loosened since the fall, with bond yields falling, which has also brought down mortgage rates, and the stock market posted a solid gain in January. Does that make your job of combating inflation harder? And could you see lifting
これは通過して上がっていくのか。
otherwise would to offset the increase in, or to offset the easing of financial conditions?
So it is important that overall financial conditions continue to reflect the policy restraint that we're putting in place in order to bring inflation down to 2%. And of course, financial conditions have tightened very significantly over the past year. I would say that our focus is not on short-term moves, but on sustained changes to broader financial conditions. And it is our judgment that we're not yet at a sufficiently restrictive policy stance, which is why we say that we expect ongoing hikes will be appropriate. Of course, many things affect financial conditions, not just our policy. And we will take into account overall financial conditions along with many other factors as we set policy.
Hi, Chair Powell. Thank you for taking our questions. Rachel Siegel from the Washington Post. Over the last quarter, we've seen a deceleration in prices, in wages, and a fall in consumer spending, all while the unemployment rate has been able to stay at a historic low. Does this at all change your view of how much the unemployment rate would need to go up, if at all, to see inflation come down to the levels you're looking for?
So I would say it is a good thing that the disinflation that we have seen so far
雇用率はどこまで
at the expense of a weaker labor market.
上がる必要があるか。
That disinflationary process that you now see underway is really at an early stage. What you see is really in the goods sector, you see inflation now coming down because supply chains have been
上がっていっちゃってる。
to services and shortages have been abated. So you see that in the housing services sector, we expect inflation to continue moving up for a while, but then to come down, assuming that new leases continue to be lower. So in those two sectors, you've got a good story. The issue is that we have a large sector called non-housing service, core non-housing services, where we don't see disinflation yet. But I would say that so far, what we see is progress, but without any weakening in labor market conditions. Go ahead.
Has your expectation for where the unemployment
無事通過なんでしょうかね。
You know, we're going to write down new forecasts at the March meeting, and we'll see at that time. I will say that it is gratifying to see the disinflationary process now getting underway, and we continue to get strong labor market data. But you know, we'll update those forecasts in March.
Hi, Chair Powell. Neil Irwin with Axios. You and some of your colleagues have emphasized the possibility that job openings could come down and that that would let some of the air out of the labor market without major job losses. We saw the opposite in the December jolts this morning, job openings actually rising. that also has coincided with slowdown in wage inflation. Do you believe that openings are an important indicator to be studying to understand where the labor market is and where wage inflation might be heading?
So you're right about the data, of course. What we've seen average hourly earnings and now the employment cost index abating a little bit, still off of their highs of 6 months ago and more, but still at levels that are fairly elevated. The job openings number in JOLTS has been quite volatile recently, and I did see that it moved back up this morning. I do think that it's probably an important indicator. The ratio, I guess, is back up to 1.9 job openings to unemployed people who are looking for work. So it's an
テスラ買うか今ちょっと。上げ上げだな。
If you look across the rest of the labor market, you still see very high payroll job creation, and
まあでもちょっと。
quits are still at an elevated level. So by many indicators.
まあね、今日は動かん方がいいな。
Thank you. Colby Smith with the Financial Times. Given the economic data since the December meeting, is the trajectory for the Fed funds rate in the most recent SEP still the best guidepost for the policy path forward? Or does ongoing now mean more than 2 rate rises now?
So you're right. At the December meeting, we all wrote down our best estimates of what we thought the ultimate level would be. And that's obviously back in December. And the median for that was between 5 and 5.25%. At the March meeting, we're going to update those assessments. We did not update them today. We did, however, continue to say that we believe ongoing rate hikes will be appropriate to attain a sufficiently restrictive stance of policy to bring inflation back down to 2%. We think we've covered a lot of ground, and financial conditions have certainly tightened. And I would say we still think there's work to do there. We haven't made a decision on exactly where that will be. I think we're going to be looking carefully at the incoming data between now and the March meeting and the May meeting.
ドル円崩れました？ああ、128円までいったね。貫通した。129円台が128円台に。
In the other direction, then we'll make data-dependent decisions at coming meetings, of course.
Quick follow-up: how are you viewing the kind of balance of risk between those two options of, the likelihood of maybe falling short of that or going beyond that level?
I guess I would say it this way: I continue to think that it's very difficult to manage the risk of doing too little and finding out in 6 or 12 months that we actually were close but didn't get the job done, and inflation springs back and we have to go back in, and now you really do worry about expectations getting unanchored and that kind of thing. This is a very difficult risk to manage. Whereas, of course, we have no incentive and no desire to over tighten, but if we feel like we've gone too far, we could certainly, and inflation is coming down faster than we expect, then we have tools that would work on that. So I do think that in this situation where we have
ああ、そうなんですか。
the job is not fully done. As I started to mention earlier, we have a sector that represents 56% of the core inflation index where we don't see disinflation yet. So we don't see it. It's not happening. Inflation in services X housing is
株も SP が4100円タッチしたんで。
Nothing happening there. In the other two sectors, representing less than 50%, you actually, I think, now have a story that is credible, that's coming together. Although you don't actually see disinflation yet in housing services, but it's in the pipeline, right? So for the third sector, we don't see anything here. So I think it would be very premature to declare victory or to
買いたくなるよね、こう上がってるとね。
Our goal, of course, is to bring inflation down. And how do we get that done? There are many factors driving inflation in that sector, and they should be coming into play to have inflation, the disinflationary process, begin in that sector. But so far, we don't see that. And I think until we do, we see ourselves as having a lot of work left to do.
Howard Schneider with Reuters, and thanks as usual. So I just wanted to connect a couple dots here. The statement made a number of changes that seem to be saying things are getting better. You're saying inflation has eased. That's new. You've taken out references to the war in Ukraine as causing price increases. You've taken out references to the pandemic. You've eliminated all the reasons that you said prices were being driven higher. Yet that's not mapping to any change in how you describe policy. We still have ongoing increases to come. So I'm wondering, why is that the case? And does it have more to do with uncertainty around the outlook, or more to do with you not wanting to give a very overeager market a reason to get ahead of itself and overreact?
So I guess I would say it this way. We can now say, I think, for the first time, that the disinflationary process has started. We can see that, and we see it really in goods prices so far. Goods prices is a big sector. This is what we thought would happen since the very beginning, and now here it is actually happening, and for the reasons we thought. It's supply chains, it's shortages, and it's demand revolving back towards services. So this is a good thing. This is a good thing. But that's, around a quarter of the PCE price index, core PCE price index. So the second sector is housing services, and that's driven by very different things. And we, as I mentioned, with housing services, we expect, and other forecasters expect, that measured inflation will continue moving up for several months, but will then come down, assuming that new leases continue to be soft. And we do assume that. So we think that that's sort of in the pipeline. And we actually see disinflation in the goods pipeline for two sectors that are less than half. So this is good. And we note that when we say inflation is coming down, this is good. We expect to see that disinflation process will be seen, we hope soon, in the core goods the core services ex-housing sector that I talked about. We don't see it yet. It's 7 or 8 different kinds of services. Not all of them are the same, and we have a sense of what's going on in each of those different subsections. Probably the biggest part of it, probably 60% of that research would show is sensitive to slack in the economy, and so the labor market will probably be important. Some of the other ones, the labor market's not going to be important. Many other factors will drive it. In any case, we don't see disinflation in that sector yet, and I think we need to see that. It's the majority of the core PCE index, which is the thing that we think is the best predictor of headline PCE, which is our mandate. So it's not that we're neither optimistic nor pessimistic. We're just telling you that we don't see inflation moving down yet in that large sector. I think we will fairly soon, but we don't see it yet. Until we do, I think we see ourselves, we got to be honest with ourselves, we see ourselves as having perhaps we'll see more persistent inflation in that sector, which will take longer to get down. And we're just going to have to complete the job. I mean, that's what we're here for.
Nick Timmeros, The Wall Street Journal. Chair Powell, you observed several years ago that we learned
Nickじゃん。
low unemployment rate without above target inflation, and we have learned lately that inflation can come down from its uncomfortably high level despite a historically low unemployment rate. Given that, and given how much you did over the last year, why do you think further rate increases are needed? Why
ニックが来ると下がっていてんの。
transpires in the coming months before raising rates again?
So we've raised rates 4.5%.
ああ、利下げするかどうか聞いてんのかもしかして。
Rate hikes to get to that level we think is appropriately restrictive. And why do we think that's probably necessary? We think because inflation is still running very hot. We're, of course, taking into account long and variable lags, and we're thinking about that. The story we're telling about inflation is, to ourselves, and the way we understand it, is basically the three things that I've just gone through a couple times. And again, we don't see it affecting the services sector ex-housing yet. But I mean, I think our assessment is that we're not very far from that level. We don't know that, though. We don't know that. So I think we're living in a world of significant uncertainty. I would look across the spectrum of rates and see that real rates are now positive, right, by an appropriate set of measures, or positive across the yield curve. I think policy is restrictive. We're trying to make a fine judgment about how much is restrictive enough. That's all. And we're going to, that's why we're slowing down to 25 basis points. We're going to be carefully watching the economy and watching inflation and watching the progress of the disinflationary process.
Did you or your colleagues discuss the conditions for a pause at this meeting this week?
You'll see the minutes will come out in 3 weeks, and we'll give you a lot of detail. We spent a lot of time talking about the path ahead and the state of the economy, and I wouldn't want to start to describe all the details there, but that was the sense of the discussion, was really talking quite a bit about the path forward.
Victoria? Hi, Chair Powell. I wanted to ask about the debt ceiling. Given that we've now hit up against it, I was wondering if the U.S. goes past the X date, will the Fed do whatever the Treasury directs as it relates to making payments as the fiscal agent, or will it do its own analysis of any legal constraints?
So your question is, would we...
3月の利上げ決定ってこと？もしかして。
Will the Fed do what Treasury directs as it relates to making payments, or will it do its own analysis of any legal constraints?
So you're really asking about... You're asking about prioritization, in effect, is what
yes,
you're... Okay.
Yes.
So I feel like I have to say this. There's only one way forward here, and that is for Congress to raise the debt ceiling so that the United States government can pay all of its obligations when due. And any deviations from that path would be highly risky, and that no one should assume that the Fed can protect the economy from the consequences of failing to act in a timely manner. In terms of our relationship with the Treasury, we are their fiscal agent.
利上げかな、これ。
I'm just going to leave it at that.
ちょっと目が痛い。
Actively doing any planning of what might happen in the event that would happen?
I'm just going to leave it at that. This is a matter that's to be resolved between, it's really Congress's job to raise the debt ceiling, and I gather there are discussions happening, but they don't involve us. We're not involved in those discussions.
上げっぽいよな。
We're the fiscal agent.
さすがにこれ。
Gina Smiley from the New York Times. Thanks for taking our questions. I wonder, was there any discussion today of the possibility of pausing?
でも利確してくるよな、これくらいになるともう上がったら。
The Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas seemed to suggest that would be a possibility in a recent speech, and I wonder if that view is broadly shared on the committee.
So, the committee, obviously, did not see this as a time to pause. We judged that the appropriate thing to do at this meeting was to raise the federal funds rate by 25 basis points, and we said that we continue to anticipate that ongoing increases in the target range will be appropriate in order to attain that stance of sufficiently restrictive monetary policy that will bring inflation down to 2%. So that's the judgment that we made. We're gonna write down new forecasts in March, and we'll certainly be looking at the incoming data as everyone else will.
Sorry, I should have been clear. I mean, would it be possible to take a meeting off, for example, and then resume? Could you, rather than just doing at every meeting a move, go a little bit more slowly, take some gaps in between moves?
I mean, I think this is not something that the committee is thinking about or exploring in any kind of detail. In principle, though, we used to do was go every other meeting, if you remember, 25 basis points, and that was considered a fast pace. So I think a lot of options are available, and I mean, you saw what the Bank of Canada did, and they left it that they're willing to raise rates after pausing. But this is not something that the Federal Open Market Committee is on the point of deciding right now.
Steve Leisman, CNBC. Mr. Chairman, the SEP has the PCE inflation rate in 2023 at 3.1%. Meanwhile, the 3-month annualized PCE is 2.1%, and you've achieved this without going to your 5.1% funds rate, which is what you have penciled in for this year. And you've also achieved it without the 1%.
カナダ銀行は利上げ停止したけど、
I'm wondering if you've considered the idea of whether or not your understanding of the inflation dynamic may be wrong, and it's possible to achieve these things without raising rates that high, and also without the surge in unemployment. And specifically, I wonder if you might comment on the speech given by Vice Chair Lael Brainerd, who said, to the extent that inputs other than wages may be responsible in part for important price increases for some non-housing services,
ちょっとわかんない、これちょっと。
may not be wages, the idea that it may not require unemployment rising to get this sector of inflation under control. Thanks.
So a couple things. First, on the on the forecast, if you're right, if you take very short-term three-month say measures of PCE, core PCE inflation, they're quite low right now. But that's because that's driven by significantly negative readings from goods inflation. Most forecasters would think that the significantly negative readings will be transitory, and that goods inflation will move up fairly soon back up to its longer run trend of something around zero, something like that. So a lot of forecasts would call for core PCE to go back up to 4% by the middle of the year, for example. So that's really where the sustainable level is more like at 4%. So that would suggest there's work left to do. Let's say inflation does come down much faster than we expect, which is possible. As I mentioned, obviously our policy is data dependent. We would take that into account. In terms of the core non-housing services, as I mentioned earlier, it's a very diverse sector, 6 or 7 sectors, and
思うにね、利下げはしないよっていうのは確実で、全然利上げ全然続行するよって言ってるから、仮に利上げ大きくしちゃっても、簡単に下げれるから、全然利上げしまくるよって言ってんだよね。で、これで買い向かうかっていう話ですよね。株を。これで楽観になるかっていう話ですね。ここで株売りだろう。ここ売りだろう。普通に。こっから。もう上がんねえだろう。ここで売りだろう。ここ売り入るか。儲けるのはここで売りポイントだな。こっから買いに向かうのはリスキーすぎるね。売りでしょうね、ここで。ここで売りだろう。
that unemployment will probably rise a bit from here, but I continue to think that there's a path to getting inflation back down to 2% without a really significant economic decline or a significant increase in unemployment.
まあでも決算しかねえからな。
The setting we're in is quite different. The inflation that we originally got was very much a collision between very strong demand and hard supply constraints, not something that you really have seen in prior business cycles. And so now we see goods inflation coming down for the reasons we thought, and
CFD1 枚売るか。ちょっと CFD1 枚売ります。1枚だけ売りを買いますか。で、まあ逆差しに入れて。
Certainly possible. Yeah, absolutely, it's possible. It's a question no one really knows. I think it's because this is not like the other business cycles in so many ways. It may well be
そこへ逆差しに入れて。
that it will take more slowing than we expect, than I expect to get inflation down to 2%. But I don't. That's not my base case. My base case is that the economy can return to 2% inflation without a really significant downturn or a really big increase in unemployment. I think that's a possible outcome. I think many forecasters would say it's not the most likely outcome, but I would say there's a chance of it.
Michael McKee from Bloomberg TV and Radio. I'd like to pick up on what you were just saying about a substantial downturn and ask, with the full weight of your tightening not in place yet, and with the progress against inflation, there's still a lot of talk about very, very slow growth going forward in 2023, and the recession indicators are all suggesting that we are going to see recession this year. So I'm wondering if you've changed your view, or you have a more nuanced view of what you think the danger to economic growth is going forward, and whether you're very close to perhaps tipping it into the wrong place, which calls for more restraint on your part.
So I do think most forecasts and my own assessment would be that growth will continue, positive growth will continue, but at a subdued pace, as it did last year. We had growth of GDP growth of 1% last year, and also final sales growth, which we think is a better indicator of about 1%. I think most forecasts and certainly my assessment would be that growth will continue at a fairly subdued level this year. There are other factors, though, that need to be considered. You will have seen that the global picture is improving a bit, and that will matter for us potentially. The labor market remains very, very strong, and that's job creation, that's wages. As inflation does come down, sentiment will improve. You also, state and local governments are really flush these days with money, and many of them are considering tax cuts or even sending checks. So I think that's going to support. They're also spending a lot. There's a lot of spending coming in the construction pipeline, both private and public, and so that's going to support economic activity. So I think there's a good chance that those factors will help support positive growth this year, and that's my base case is that there will be positive growth this year.
馬の実テスラが180ドルを超えられるかどうかの瀬戸際。
ああ、そうなんですか。テスラ上がってきてますか。よかったですね。テスラ買っときゃよかったか。こんな上がるだったら。テスラ買っときゃよかったな。3%か。でもあともうちょっと180度いきそうですね。
The labor market coming back into better balance to have that substantially more evidence.
So I don't think there's going to be a light switch flipped or anything like that. I think it's just an accumulating evidence. So of course we'll be looking, by the time of the March meeting, we'll have 2 more employment reports, 2 more CPI reports, and we'll be looking at those carefully, as all of us will, and we'll be asking ourselves, what are they telling us? And soon after that, we'll have another ECI wage report, which, as you know, is a report that we like because it adjusts for composition and it's very complete. And the one we got, I guess it was yesterday, was constructive. It shows wages coming down, but still at a high level. They're still at a level that's well above where they were before the pandemic. So I don't want to put a number on it in terms of months, but as the accumulated evidence comes in, it's going to be reflected in our assessment of the outlook, and that will be reflected in our policy over time. But I will say it is our job to restore price stability and inflation for the benefit of the American public. We're not. Market participants have a very different job. And it's a fine job. It's a great job. In fact, I did that job for years, but in one form or another. But we have to deliver that, and so we are strongly resolved that we will complete this task because we think it has benefits that will support economic activity and benefit the public for many, many years.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Fed Chairman, for taking the questions. So you've talked about we had solid job growth. I'm Edward Lawrence from Fox Business, by the way. We had solid job growth, a slight falling in the increase in consumer spending. It seems so far it's been relatively mild from the economy.
木曜のアフターっすよね。で、金曜の10時に雇用統計なんでね。金曜からじゃないと動けないですね。なんで、金曜まで早く寝て、英気を養った方がいいかもしれないですね。
Congress did what it did, and we did what we did. It's unique. So I think certainty is just not inflation. It's just harder to forecast inflation. It may come down faster. It may take longer to come down. And our job is to deliver
倉持さん遅くまでありがとうございました。おやすみなさい。ありがとうございました。
About declaring victory and sending signals that we think that the game is won because we've got a long way to go. It's the early stages of disinflation, and it's most welcome to be able to say that we are now in disinflation, but that's great. But we just see that it has to spread through the economy and that it's going to take some time. That's all.
How long do you see then the federal funds rate remaining at this elevated level?
So again, my forecast and that of my colleagues, as you will see from the SEP, and I mean there are many different forecasts, but generally it's a forecast of slower growth, some softening in labor market conditions, and inflation moving down steadily, but not quickly.
自分は一旦仮眠取りましたね。
If the economy performs broadly in line with those expectations, it will not be appropriate to cut rates this year, to loosen policy this year. Of course, other people have forecasts with inflation coming down much faster. That's a different thing. If that happens, if inflation comes down much faster, then we'll be seeing that, and it will be incorporated into our thinking about policy.
Thank you, Chair Powell. Simon Rabinovich with The Economist. May I ask a further question about the language around ongoing increases? That, of course, implies at least 2 further rate rises. If you look at Fed Fund futures pricing, the implication is that you'll raise rates one more time.
これは上がりすぎだな。
Are you concerned about that divergence, or do you think if everything breaks right, is that a plausible outcome?
I'm not particularly concerned about the divergence, no, because it is largely due to the market's expectation that inflation will move down more quickly. I think that's the bigger part of that. So again, as I just mentioned, our forecasts, different participants have different forecasts, but generally those forecasts are for continued subdued growth, some softening in the labor market, but not a recession, and we have inflation moving down, into the somewhere in the mid 3s or maybe lower than that this year. We'll update that in March, but that's what we thought in December. Markets are past that. They show inflation coming down in some cases much quicker than that. So we'll just have to see. And we have a different view, it's a different forecast really. Given our outlook, I don't see us cutting rates this year if we get our outlook turns true. As I mentioned just now, if we do see inflation coming down much more quickly, that'll play into our policy setting, of course.
Hi, Chair Powell. Scott Horsley from NPR. One of the changes in the statement this month is that the committee is no longer listing public health as among the data points you'll consider in assessing conditions.
今日めっちゃ上がるな。
Does the Federal Reserve no longer see the pandemic as weighing on
20% いくのがそくる。
That's the general sense of it. Look, I personally understand well that COVID is still out there, but that it's no longer playing an important role in our economy, and we kept that statement in there for quite a while, and I think we just
ショートカバー壊しに来たかな。
But we thought that people are handling it better, and the economy and the society are handling it better now. It doesn't really need to be in the Fed's monthly or post-meeting statement as an ongoing economic risk, as
ショー
opposed
ト
to
カバー上げすごいなちょっと。
Hi, Chair Powell. Nancy Marshall-Genzer with Marketplace. Wanted to go back to another thing that Fed Vice Chair Lael Brainerd said recently. She said she doesn't see signs of a wage price spiral, and I'm wondering if you agree with that.
I do. Yeah, I do. I don't see that yet, but the whole point is, once you see it, you have a serious problem. That means that effectively in people's decision making, inflation has become a really salient issue, and once that happens, that's what we can't allow to happen. And so that's why we worry that the longer we're at this and the longer people are talking about inflation all day long, every day, the more risk of something like that. But no, there's not much. It's more of a risk. It always has been more of a risk than anything else. By the way, I think it's becoming less salient, and people are, we pick that up in conversations, and I've seen some data too that show people are, gradually, they're glad that inflation's coming down. People really don't like inflation, And as we see it coming down, that could also add a boost to economic activity. You look at the sentiment surveys now, and they're very, very low. With 3.5% unemployment and high wage increases nominally by historical standards, why can that be? It has to be inflation, right? So I think once inflation is seen to be coming down in coming months, even you will also see a boost to sentiment, I hope.
So that's what you're looking at most closely is consumer expectations.
That's at the very heart. It's consumers and businesses that essentially. We believe that expectations of future inflation are a very important part of the process of creating inflation. That's a sort of a bedrock belief. In one way or another, it has to be. We think it's important. In this case, I would say the risk 8 months ago or so, longer-term inflation expectations had moved up. We moved quite vigorously last year. Expectations seem to be well anchored, including
あ、これ無料ですね。
not just the longer end. So it's and I think that's very reassuring. I think the markets have decided and the public has decided that inflation is going to come back down to 2%, and it's just a matter of us following through. That's immeasurably helpful to the process of getting inflation down. The fact that people now do generally believe that it will come down, that'll be part of the process of getting it down, and it's a very positive thing.
Thank you, Chair Powell. Greg Ropp from Market Watch. In the minutes of the December meeting, there was a couple sentences that struck me.
利確下げ来てんね。
The committee said participants talked about this unwarranted easing of financial conditions was a risk, and it would make your life harder to bring inflation down. I haven't heard you talk much about that today or in the statement, so I was wondering, has that concern eased among members, or is that still something you're concerned about? Thank you.
I would put it this way. It's something that we monitor carefully. Financial conditions didn't really change much from the December meeting to now. They mostly went sideways or up and down, but came out in roughly the same place. It's important that the markets do reflect the tightening that we're putting in place. As we've discussed a couple times here, there's a difference in perspective by some market measures on how fast inflation will come down. We're just going to have to see. I'm not going to try to persuade people to have a different forecast. But our forecast is that it will take some time and some patience, and that we'll need to keep rates higher for longer. But we'll see.
Go to Brendan for the last question.
Hi, Chair Powell. Brendan Peterson with Punchbowl News. I wanted to ask if the Fed takes into account at all the debt ceiling when it comes to quantitative tightening, given the fact that rapid or faster quantitative tightening could bring us closer faster to that drop-dead debt ceiling deadline. Could it play an effect as we get closer to that drop-dead deadline this summer?
It's very hard to think about all the different possible ramifications, and I think the answer is basically I don't think there's likely to be any important interaction between the two, because I believe Congress will wind up acting, and as it will and must in the end, to raise the debt ceiling in a way that doesn't risk the progress we're making against inflation and the economy and the financial sector. I believe that will happen. I believe it will happen. We of course will monitor money market conditions carefully as the process moves on. For example, the Treasury General account will shrink down and then it will grow back up, and we understand there'll be lots of flows between there and the overnight repo facility and reserves. We understand all that. We're watching it carefully. We'll just be monitoring it. Thank you very much.
終わっちゃった。終わっちゃったね。終わってから落ちるのか。終わってから落ちるのか。
レイン終わりましたね。
そうですね。 ちょっと上げすぎで落ちるかな。あー。これさ、ちょっと上げすぎだな。もうちょっと上がりそうな雰囲気あるんだよね。ちょっと上がりそうですな。
レイン、右の時間5秒くらい遅れてますね。
んあ、そうですか。
レイン、うん。
まあ、そんなもんでしょ。ライブ中継なんで。4時間足は、高いからな。無理だろうと思うけどな。この流れなら。この勢いの明日も上がりそうな気がするけどな。売るか迷うな。テスラな。上げなのか。もうちょっと上がるのかな、これ。変わりすぎだけど。変わりすぎなんだよな。 変わりすぎなんだよな。剥離もすごいからな。金曜の雇用統計で落としてくるのかな。上げだな。今日メタだよね、この後。天井臭いよな。かなり。天井臭いけど一旦突破した気もするんだけどね。 500万ぐらい売るか。500万ぐらい入るか。売りで。売りで入っても、いや、買われすぎだよな、さすがにこれは。そういうか。えげつな上げだな。これ本当か？一旦上がり出すと強いからな。で、こんなに上がって次の日も上がるかっていう話だよな。ここならわかるけどね。この状態だからな。この状態でしょ。まさに。次の日大暴落って。ちょっと1000万。いや、上がりすぎだろう。さすがに。さすがに、こっから上がるの。富士通貨で上がるの？そんなに警戒して下げてた？これはバーイングクライマックスだろう。まあちょっと、まあ20万ぐらいなら負けてもいいんで、ちょっと、VGT 売るか。 VGT 売りで入るか。大きな要線はね。まあ、サイン出てるんで、VGT 売るか。400か。10万ドル。10万ドル。10万ドル。行くわ。とりあえず。VGT。いい特定。
レイン、今、1ドルいくらなの？
1億128円ぐらいじゃないですかね。 じゃあこれどうなるかだな。ちょっと。じゃあちょっとこれでちょっと明日見てくるか。落ちてるといいんだけど。動かずを見てるか。VGT 売りでね、ちょっと明日見てみるか。ということで今日はこの辺で終わりたいと思います。では、いらっしゃいませ。ではでは、ありがとうございました。いらっしゃいませ。ではでは、ありがとうございました。お疲れ様です。